Welcome to the Pan Am Podcast, brought to you by the Pan Am Museum in Garden City, New York. This podcast and our museum are dedicated to celebrating the legacy of the world's most iconic airline, Pan American World Airways. My name is Tom Betty, and I'm the host of this program. Thank you for joining us. This program is sponsored by the generous support of Mr. Adam Aron, the CEO of AMC Entertainment Holdings Incorporated. The Pan Am Museum Foundation is a non-profit organization. Please visit our website for more information at thepanammuseum.org. Again, our website is thepanammuseum.org. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. If you are using Apple Podcasts, please consider leaving a review. It will help others discover this program. If you're not familiar with Pan Am, welcome. We are honored to have you here, and for you to learn about what we're all about. If you already know of Pan Am, worked for or flown on the airline, or just love our history, it's good to be with you again. So with that, let's get this episode in the air, so to speak. Welcome aboard your Pan American Jet Clipper. In this episode, we'll be recognizing the 31st anniversary of Pan American World Airways ceasing operations. We will explore the lead-up to and the tumultuous year of 1991, which ended with the shutdown of Pan Am. We will then be joined by the last CEO and chairman of Pan Am, Russell Ray Jr., and talk about his unpredictable and short time as the last leader of the airline. Then we will talk to the last Clipper, Captain Mark Pyle, who flew the last revenue flight of Pan American. But first, we would like to share a joint statement regarding new developments of the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. The following is a joint statement from the Pan Am Historical Foundation, the Pan Am Museum Foundation, World Wings International, and Clipper Pioneers. While Pan Am no longer exists as an airline, these four organizations represent the Pan Am family today. Here is the statement. It will be 34 years next week since the tragic and senseless bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland on December 21st, 1988. We remember all the victims, the passengers, the Pan Am crew, and those killed on the ground. Our deepest condolences to the families of those who were lost. That day forever changed the Pan Am family and still brings the deepest sadness and sorrow in reflection. The United States was deliberately attacked by terrorists, and our beloved airline was the target. In the aftermath of this horrible terrorist attack, we saw the sunlight of what is good in humanity as we witnessed the neighbors and citizens of Lockerbie coming together to help all involved, especially the families of the victims. On December 11th, 2022, we were given some solace knowing that American justice may finally be served with the arrest and extradition of the suspect in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. We thank the United States Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the wider intelligence community for their decades-long dedication to bringing those responsible to justice. They have never forgotten about Pan Am Flight 103, and we are forever grateful. Again, that's a joint statement from the Pan Am Historical Foundation, the Pan Am Museum Foundation, World Wings International, and the Clipper Pioneers. Now let's explore the events that led up to December 1991, the concluding chapter of Pan American. Many consider the beginning of the end of the airline to be the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie. CEO and Chairman Thomas G. Plaskett began his tenure in January of 1988, taking over from Ed Acker. Throughout 1988, many in the airline had a sense of hope that under Plaskett's leadership, Pan Am was changing course for the better, and its long-term outlook started to brighten. In fact, Pan Am had a very profitable third quarter in 1988, and many thought that the future outlook of the airline was positive. All of this changed on December 21st when Pan Am Flight 103 exploded as a result of a terrorist bomb. Following the tragedy, ticket sales dramatically slowed at an alarming rate. Passengers did not want to fly on Pan Am, as it was now a prime target for terrorism. On December 5, 1988, an unidentified individual telephoned the U.S. Embassy in Helsinki and stated that sometime within the next 2 weeks, there would be a bombing attempt against a Pan American aircraft flying from Frankfurt to the United States. The Reagan administration quickly informed and warned government personnel in Europe. That action included a notice posted in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow warning of the possible danger of flying Pan Am through Frankfurt and suggesting that embassy staff might like to go home another way. The Federal Aviation Administration did send a security bulletin through general communication channels to the Pan Am Frankfurt station. The airline's operation headquarters in New York was not notified. The teletype did not come through an emergency channel and was not flagged. It unfortunately went overlooked during the extremely busy holiday travel season, only to be discovered the day after the bombing. There is no known evidence there was any direct communication with the airline from U.S. government officials, law enforcement, or intelligence representatives on this security issue. The outgoing Reagan administration and the incoming Bush administration both stated after the bombing that the government notified the airlines of a potential security concern in the FAA bulletin. Adding to the financial stress of the airline, Pan Am then faced a $300 million lawsuit filed by more than 100 families of the victims. In response, Pan Am subpoenaed records of 6 U.S. government agencies, including the Central Intelligence Agency, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the State Department, to prove that the U.S. government was acutely aware of a potential bombing, warned government personnel not to fly on Pan Am, and failed to offer any assistance or important information to Pan Am to help prevent the attack. Even though the information obtained shined an important spotlight on the intelligence community's failures to communicate and warn the airline, some of the victims' families accused Pan Am of attempting to publicly shift the blame of responsibility, which did not help Pan Am's public image. In addition, adding to the brewing public relations problems, soon after the crash, the FAA cited and fined Pan Am for 19 security failures out of 236 that were detected amongst 29 airlines. All of this sets the stage to a tumultuous period that would end with the airline ceasing operations 3 years later. With the evaporation of passengers booking on Pan Am and the unstable finances of the airline, Thomas Plaskett began 1989 with grave concern and trepidation. In order for the airline to survive, it had to do something bold. Under the leadership of his predecessor, Ed Acker, Pan Am looked for possible buyers, including American Airlines. But after reviewing the airline's financials with high labor costs and pension responsibilities, no airline was interested in buying. So courting a potential buyer had already been tried and was not viable. But Plaskett came up with a new plan that, if successful, would have been considered one of the most remarkable comebacks in corporate history. His plan, backed by 4 major banks and presented in June of 1989, was a $2.7 billion takeover bid of Northwest Airlines. The merger would have given Pan Am a stronger domestic network to strengthen its hubs in New York and Miami and regain the airline's Pacific routes that were sold by his predecessor to United Airlines in 1985. In addition, the Pan Am Northwest merger was expected to have an annual savings of $240 million. Sadly, Plaskett was outmaneuvered by billionaire investor Al Checkey, who outbid Pan Am with the final sale price of $3.6 billion. Pan Am's hopes of returning as a dominant player in the airline business were dashed, and this turned out to be the final attempt of the airline to create a strong domestic network to compete with growing carriers like United, American Airlines, and Delta, which already had strong domestic route systems and were rapidly expanding. In August of 1990, things got worse for Pan Am. Iraq invaded Kuwait, which began the first Gulf War. As a result, fuel prices skyrocketed, causing a severe global economic disruption. To cope with these unforeseen economic declines, Pan Am was forced to sell the airline's most coveted routes to London Heathrow, to United Airlines, and its operations in Berlin to Lufthansa, shoring up a total of $1.2 billion. But that was not enough to avert bankruptcy for the troubled airline, and the economic recession did not improve. Keep in mind that there were no bailouts or government loans from either the Reagan or Bush administrations to the airlines in 1988 after the Lockerbie terrorist bombing and during this period of economic uncertainty that hit the commercial aviation business particularly hard. Let's take a listen to a clip from ABC News on January 8th, 1991.
Well, the situation in the Persian Gulf may have pushed Pan American over the edge. The airline has filed for bankruptcy today, blaming, among other things, the rising cost of jet fuel. Here's ABC's Stephen Ogg.
Pan American World Airways, perhaps more than any other airline, pioneered international aviation in the 30s and 40s with its famed Pan Am Clippers.
And it was that spirit, that pioneering spirit that permeated the whole aviation field at that particular time.
But when the government deregulated the airlines in 1978, domestic airlines acquired routes overseas, taking business that used to belong to Pan Am, while Pan Am never built up a domestic route system and suffered huge losses. To raise money, Pan Am sold off its Pacific routes, its famous building in New York, and most recently its prized routes to London and Paris. The bombing of Pan Am 103 made things worse. Finally, the Persian Gulf crisis sent fuel prices soaring.
We simply didn't have the financial strength in reserve to absorb the adverse economic impacts of these external events.
Plaskett says a new $150 million loan will keep the airline flying its usual schedule while it reorganizes its finances. But outside observers see a different future for Pan Am.
I think that the carrier is quite likely to be dismantled and sold piecemeal to other stronger carriers.
Right now, planes are flying at Pan Am. Tickets are being honored. But Pan Am's survival depends on whether consumers have enough confidence to keep buying tickets. Stephen Ogg, ABC News, Washington.
On Wall Street today, the Dow Jones Industrials lost more than 13 points to close at 2509.
Plaskett was faced with a daunting task of how to save his airline, and now he had to work through a bankruptcy court. In the end, he was faced with no other options but to sell Pan Am's most valuable assets and form a leaner, smaller airline that was referred to as Pan Am 2, focused on South America. Let's take a listen to another news clip. This is from NBC News on July 12, 1991.
Pan Am, a grand old airline that's about to become little more than a memory of its glory days. It has sold now its most valuable assets to Delta, Pan Am's routes to exotic locations, and some closer to home as well. NBC's Stephen Frazier.
Once the proudest symbol of aviation success, Pan Am is now all but liquidated. At Los Angeles International, flight attendants saluted their company.
I have nothing but gratitude for Pan Am. They hired me from Finland 22 years ago. I have had fabulous time with Pan Am.
I wouldn't have traded this job for anything in the world, in spite of all the tough times.
We interrupt this program to bring you the latest report on the China Clipper.
Before the tough times, there were glory years, decades of pioneering innovations and commercial dominance. The first scheduled international flight, Key West to Havana, 1927. The first meals aloft, first radio communications with pilots, first to navigate by radio direction finder. Charles Lindbergh mapped routes and tried out inventions, and Pan Am's association with the world's most famous aviator added to its mystique. The China Clipper flying boat launched regular service across the Pacific in 1935, hopping from island to refuel. 4 years later, the Dixie Clipper inaugurated service across the Atlantic. Pan Am was the first to switch to jets, the carrier of the rich and famous. It also was first with economy class fares.
Pan Am's troubles started shortly after the airline industry was deregulated in 1978, permitting companies that never financed such innovations to chip away at its preeminence. Only 3 years later, Pan Am was losing $19 million and had to sell its headquarters building in New York.
Not even a hugely profitable shuttle service linking Washington, New York, and Boston could offset its losses. And the terrorist bombing of a Clipper jet over Scotland reversed a comeback in 1988. Today, an industry analyst said the airline's fight for life was choked off by management mistakes and the recession.
Having lived through these last 10, 12 years and watching Pan Am waste away, it's like putting down a sick horse at this point, and it's kind of a relief to see it go away.
Pan Am flew shuttles to the moon in Stanley Kubrick's film 2001, A Space Odyssey, a future as grand as its past. Both died today. Stephen Frazier, NBC News, New York.
The selling of Pan Am's coveted assets was finalized by the bankruptcy court a month later. Let's take a listen to another news clip. This one is from CBS News on August 12, 1991. You will hear Pan Am Chairman and CEO Thomas Plaskett, as well as Delta's Chairman, Ronald Allen.
And now the airline story. Delta Airlines apparently is the big winner, as a federal bankruptcy judge today left pioneering Pan American World Airways a shadow of its former self and left thousands of Pan Am workers waiting for inevitable pink slips. Correspondent Harold Dow has more about that. Harold, good evening.
Good evening, Dan. For more than 10 years now, Pan American Airways has literally been fighting for its survival. Because of a court ruling here in New York today, Pan Am is still flying, but now it's a much smaller airline. The bankruptcy judge approved the $1.7 billion deal made by Delta Airlines to acquire Pan Am's most coveted assets. The chairman of both airlines seemed pleased with today's ruling.
From Pan Am's perspective, this is a very important day.
We at Delta Airlines look forward to moving ahead as quickly as possible with the acquisition of the assets.
Delta will acquire Pan Am's European routes and its profitable Northeast Shuttle operation. A much smaller Pan Am will continue to serve Latin America, but it will hardly be an independent operation. 45% of Pan Am will be owned by Delta, 55% by Pan Am's creditors.
For Delta Airlines, it effectively leapfrogs them into becoming a more competitive global player.
Hope you have a pleasant trip.
It was in the 1930s when Pan Am's Clipper service opened U.S. air travel to the world. But it was after deregulation of the late 70s when Pan Am began to falter. And in recent years, the airline was hit by terrorism, increased fuel costs, and the effects of the Gulf War. They all proved too much for the airline to handle. Under today's deal, 13,500 Pan Am jobs will be preserved. 8,500 jobs will be lost. One Pan Am employee told us the airline was like a family, and today's news hit like a death in the family. Dan?
Harold, of course, what happens to the workers is most important, but what happens to outstanding Pan Am tickets and frequent flyer miles?
Well, Delta officials tell us they will honor Pan Am tickets, and they will also honor the frequent flyer program.
Harold Dow, live here in New York. Thanks.
Thousands of Pan Am employees were interviewed and hired by Delta in the fall of 1991. The remaining employees would stay for Pan Am 2, and the headquarters would be moved from New York to Miami. In late September 1991, Thomas Plaskett resigned as chairman and CEO of Pan Am. His reasons have never been made clear. Speculation ranged from him not wanting to be the last CEO and overseeing Pan Am's liquidation to being forced out by the board or Delta's Ron Allen. In any case, his successor was Russell Ray Jr., who would lead Pan Am in a tumultuous 100-day period, which ended as him being last CEO and chairman and the airline shutting down for good. Here is our final news clip from NBC News on December 4th, 1991.
The troubled airline industry today suffered another death in the family. Pan American Airlines shut down after more than 6 decades of service. NBC's Robert Hager has more tonight.
We are very sorry to advise you that Pan American Airways has suspended operations. All flights are canceled.
The recording on Pan Am's reservations line said it all. The airline losing $2 million a day called it quits. Thousands of passengers stranded, many airlines unwilling to honor their discount tickets. 7,500 employees off the job.
We're all upset, but it's another mountain we'll have to climb.
It's just going to be very, very difficult this Christmas.
This employee heard from her mother.
And just called me and told me not to do any more shopping because Pan Am is liquidating.
Pan Am went under in part because Delta pulled out of a deal to help finance what was left of the airline. All the nation's airlines are hurting. Of what were the 12 largest, Eastern is out of business, so is Midway, and now Pan Am. Continental operates under Chapter 11 bankruptcy, as does America West and TWA effective next month. That's half the largest airlines, the others hanging on. Business seemed finally to be coming back this summer, but lately it's been off again. November ridership figures due out shortly will actually be worse than November a year ago. As for Pan Am, which once covered the globe with flights, its famed round-the-world flights were first to go. Then, in 1985, it sold its Pacific routes to United. More recently, its Atlantic routes to United and Delta. Its shuttle sold to Delta. Today, the last of the airline, its Caribbean and South American service, closed down. With less competition, ticket prices to Latin America could go up. And as airlines continue to bleed cash, it looks like the industry could lose close to another $2 billion this year. Robert Hager, NBC News, Washington.
And this was a losing day for Wall Street. The Dow Industrials were down today in heavy trading.
Now on to our interview with Russell Ray Jr., the last CEO and chairman of Pan American World Airways. Russell Ray Jr. had a distinguished career in aviation before joining Pan Am in October of 1991 as the CEO and chairman. He served as an Air Force officer in the Strategic Air Command and then began his aviation career at Lockheed Aircraft until 1971, when he left to become head of marketing for Eastern Airlines. In 1985, he was named president of Pacific Southwest Airlines, or PSA for short. After U.S. Air acquired PSA in 1988, Mr. Ray joined Douglas Aircraft as vice president of commercial marketing until joining Pan Am in 1991. He correctly predicted in 1992 that the airline industry would consist of 4 or 5 major airlines surviving the industry's consolidation and carry the vast majority of the nation's air traffic. Thank you for joining us on the program, sir. It's quite an honor to have the last CEO of Pan American World Airways with us.
Thank you for having me, Tom. I wish I wasn't the last CEO.
Before we get into the story of the end of Pan Am, let's talk about your background, because you have a very interesting background. You worked for many Fortune 500 companies, many aviation companies, and you also were in the Air Force Strategic Air Command.
Well, that's correct, Tom. I took a commission out of college and joined the Air Force, where I met my wife, actually, in Strategic Air Command in Missouri. Flew for SAC, Strategic Air Command, and when I left, I joined the Lockheed company in Burbank, California, where I had a variety of jobs, including selling airplanes, and I met some of the Pan Am people back in those days, although I was unable to sell them an airplane. But after 11 years with Lockheed, went on to Eastern Airlines in Miami, spent 14 years there, was on the board of directors and in charge of marketing. Left Eastern a couple of years before, 5 years before it declared bankruptcy, and went to San Diego to become president and CEO of Pacific Southwest Airlines, PSA. in San Diego. We sold PSA to U.S. Air, and that was a successful for selling for the shareholders. They did all right. Left there to join McDonnell Douglas, where again I was in charge of in Long Beach, in charge of marketing the airplanes, mainly the MD-80 and the MD-11. DC-10 had been long since gone in terms of the production. From McDonnell Douglas, while I was there, I received a call from Delta Airlines, namely its CEO and Ron Allen, and asked to meet Ron and his boss, the chairman, Dave Garrett, and talk about Pan American Airlines. This is Delta Airlines asking me. Now, I used to compete fiercely with Delta when I was with Eastern, and so I got to know them through that lens. So we had mutual respect, and Delta actually didn't promise me a 100% surety. In fact, they said it was a 50-50 chance of Pan Am surviving. But they offered me the assignment as CEO and president, and with the idea that we would form a business plan to be approved by the bankruptcy court and become Pan Am 2. Having said that, they offered me a salary, and it was a good salary. I suggested that for the benefit of the employees that I cut my salary by a third and put it in the form of Pan Am 2 stock, which obviously didn't materialize. So I thought that was a better signal to the public and to the employees particularly if I didn't take everything that was offered to me in terms of cash. I went on to Pan Am, and later on, after the close of Pan Am, I had two other assignments. I was chairman and CEO of World Airways, a military airlift, and I was the principal for representative British Aerospace in the United States. That is my background, and I have other things to say, but I think that's succinct and leads us into the next phase of this interview.
The Los Angeles Times did a feature on you in January of 1992, and the headline reads, "The man who tried to rescue Pan Am, Russell Ray, was hired to save the troubled airline. Instead, his 100-day term ended with its dismantling." Let's talk about Thomas Plaskett. So he resigned from Pan Am, and they brought you in. And at that time, a lot of the assets of the company was sold. The Pacific Division was sold under Ed Acker. The Atlantic Division, Europe, was being sold or was already sold to Delta. A majority of the Pan Am employees went to Delta. The shuttle was sold by the time you got there, and you were trying to save the airline in its new form, focusing on Central and South America. Tell us about why you took the job and what you wanted to do. What were your goals when you became CEO of Pan American World Airways?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think passing up the chance to take such an opportunity with such a big name is hard to pass up. I was happy at Douglas. My home was California originally, but to return to Miami, which would be the plan under Pan Am 2, was attractive. But just the idea of trying to save something as large, it's like going into Coca-Cola and trying to save Coca-Cola. And I was enticed by that. It was intriguing. I understood there'd be some disruptions in our private life, but I guess it was just a challenge of the business. And I knew Tom Plaskett, by the way. You mentioned Tom, and I'd liked Tom a lot. And I'd never, to this day, and Tom has passed away, as you know, to this day understood why Tom left, whether it was his own doing or whether it was the decision by Delta, which, of course, as you know, would have been the major shareholder in the surviving Pan Am 2.
You begin your CEO chairmanship in October of 1991. Tell us a little bit about the ups and downs during that tumultuous period between October and December of 1991.
Well, I don't have a vivid memory of detail. I can say that one of the disappointments I had was trying to maintain the morale of the surviving employees, and I was, if I had one or two things I have to say negative, I don't have a lot of things negative to say about Delta, because they didn't make a secured promise. On the other hand, one of my complaints is that they started hiring away some of the employees without consulting me, and that bothered me. That was tumultuous. That's a good word, because it disrupted the morale of the what would have been the surviving carrier, and the employees that were not being picked lost an awful lot of self-confidence, and it was tough. Day to day, we were concerned with whether or not they'd have jobs in the future at Pan Am, and I promised them no disruption in terms of the representation, but by the union. So I would say that the biggest problem was maintaining the spirits. The other problem, and you used the word tumultuous, was preparing the business plan. I did reach out and hire a outside employee. His name was Rolf Andreessen, who was a finance officer at Eastern Airlines, and whom I knew and trusted. Of course, Eastern had gone bankrupt, and Rolf was looking for a job. And Rolf had a tremendous role in trying to put together the operating plan for approval, as did I. We met every day, and we had the cooperation of some of the surviving, if you will use that term, officers that would continue with Pan Am, because we didn't let go some of the officers in the process. And we had cooperation really from everybody trying to make the operating plan work. But the issue really, Delta was at the table in terms of listening to and approving of the operating plan. But the tumultuous problem that you mentioned, and I'll just summarize it here. I don't want to get ahead of your interview, but I'll have to say my second issue with Delta. And again, I respect Delta. They lived up to their promises up to a point. We were unable to present the operating plan to the bankruptcy court because, in your words, Delta pulled the plug ahead of the due date of the bankruptcy court. They pulled the plug 10 days before it was due to be presented. So we never had the chance, really, to show our aspirations of surviving Pan Am 2 in South America and the Caribbean. That was to me, that sticks hard with me now. On Delta's behalf, if you will, we were bleeding money. People were looking at a bankrupt airline because it was bankrupt when I got there in late September, actually, and people weren't booking away from Pan Am, and we were bleeding in the neighborhood of $2 million a day.
Wow.
Which, if the Delta board looked at with great scrutiny.
Do you think things would have turned out differently if you had a little bit more time?
Oh, sure. I think we had a solid plan, albeit the wrinkle in the plan, and you reminded me. Now, remember, this is 31 years ago, and I'm really struggling to remember some of this, but you're helping me, is that we had a plan that didn't start producing profit until the end of the first year. And because there was all these startup costs, there were re-startup costs and paying off the relocation costs of the employees who, by the way, at the moment, and I could get to that more in a second, but at the moment we're in process of moving to Miami. People were on I-95 when this wonderful company was shut down. So, having said that, Delta reasoned that we were losing operating costs of a little bit more than $2 million a day. People were not booking into a bankrupt carrier.
Let's talk about your personal feelings and the disappointment I'm sure you experienced. You told the Los Angeles Times in 1992, quote, "I felt that we could get through it. I thought that right up until the end." When did you realize that the end was near for Pan Am, and how did you deal with it on a personal level?
Well, I was the end came quickly because I received a call over the Thanksgiving weekend of that year, so it's 91, and from Ron Allen, who then was the president of and CEO of Delta. He wanted to come up with his entourage to meet in the Pan Am building in our offices, which he did, and we met off-site, and in a room full of lawyers, he announced that this, again, is 10 days before we were due in bankruptcy court to present our case, and he said, look, we're here on a sad note, but we're not going to continue to support your effort, and so we're not, in effect, approving your bankruptcy plan, your plan of survival. And I said, well, look, we haven't had a chance to present it yet. But it was a fait accompli. The Delta board was behind Ron Allen, of course, and so his, if you will, made a courtesy call. And the arrow still sticks in my back on this because it came as a surprise because there was no lead up because we were continuing over the Thanksgiving weekend to polish off the plan.
Mr. Allen from Delta Airlines said that they were, in effect, pulling the plug. Caught you by surprise. What happened next? So you realized that you didn't have an opportunity to present your plan, and you realized that the money spigot has been turned off by Delta. How did you deal with all of that?
Lousy. I felt lousy. I mean, we had already set up camp. As you remember, the plan was to move the offices out of the then Pan Am building, we still call it then and now. And as I mentioned before, our employees that were going to stay on were en route on I-95 to Miami, which we were beginning to occupy the old National Airlines offices on the premises of the Miami airport. So the turmoil began right then. I mean, those of us, we had to tell our employees, route, turn back, go home, where you don't have a job. The couple of weeks later, of course, we hadn't yet made the announcement after the meeting with Ron Allen. So on December, you'll have to shake my memory, I think it was December the 3rd or 4th of 91, we actually announced the closure of Pan Am, which stuck in my throat, obviously. And just for the record, I've been misquoted, but I've always felt that the names of the Clipper ships that were on the fuselages of the airplanes were named often after a lady. And, we often referred to the airplane as she. So when I came time to announce to the public at 0900 Eastern Standard Time in New York City, because I'll back up and I'll tell you a little bit about that, announced the cease of operations, and I said, it's time, we're going to have to shut her down, purposely referring to the lady on the ship. But the reason for the 0900 Eastern Standard Time, we had to make sure that our international fleet of airplanes, they're all over the world. We're still operating, albeit with very low load factors. And the airplanes we wanted the airplanes out of the various countries before they were attached by the local governments, and because Pan Am was a debt all around the world. But I wanted to get the airplanes airborne and out of reach of the local authorities, which by and large we did. I think there was one exception in South America where I can't recall the country, but the airplane was attached as that country's property. So it was a sad moment. I mean, if you wanted to see a crowd of former employees crying and lawyers mixed emotions, not a whole crying, that was that moment where in the Pan Am building on the third floor, I think it was, where the old reservation section was, we announced to shut her down.
Did you have a choice of staying on during the liquidation and you just decided not to do that?
I can't, that's a good question. I continued to draw down employment salary along with some others because we were going to enter a post-bankruptcy liquidation. And I stayed on. I don't recall exactly how that happened, but I went back to Miami, where we had, by the way, already put money down on a new home, which we love Miami because they're Eastern Airlines. But at any rate, we had to shut it down through the liquidation of assets. There were some assets, not much, but we had assets. So I went back to Miami, and we sat there. I think I stayed on until right after the first of the following year, and took a job later on with somebody else.
Mm-hmm. You have been in the aviation business up until this point for many years, working for Eastern Airlines, PSA, Douglas. Obviously, you knew the history of Pan American World Airways. How did you feel when you realized that you were going to be the last CEO of this company and this company would be transitioning to history?
Sick.
Do you care to elaborate a little bit?
Well, I mean, you know, it was such a tradition, Pan Am. I often think about Pan Am's legacy, its history, in terms of name recognition, as you know, because you studied Pan Am, obviously, Tom, is that, you know, in terms of name recognition, it was second only to Coca-Cola internationally. And I guess there was a little romance in, not a little, a lot of romance attached in being CEO of that great name. You know, but plus the fact, you know, you hear of all these employees who were denied a opportunity to go on to Delta Airlines and or the surviving Pan Am too. You know, you said 11,000. I don't remember the number of employees we had, but having said that, these folks were really shortchanged, and it's a terrible feeling. If you have any sense of responsibility, a lot of CEOs are there for different reasons. But I already had a pretty good career behind me, and did I need the job? You bet. When the name Pan Am was offered, I did. But I guess I have to say, it sounds corny, but I have to say that I feel so sad about those 11,000 or more employees who were left in dire straits. I hope they got jobs. I don't know if they did. I think a lot of them ended up in aviation with surviving carriers.
Do you have a message to them? It's been 31 years since the company shut down, and a lot has changed in all of our lives in that 31-year period. Looking back, do you have any kind of message that you want them to know from you?
Well, yes, I do. Now, that is such a leading question. I wish I had but I don't need any time to think about that. I hope they ended up prospering after the shock of the shutdown. I hope that my name doesn't live in infamy, because we sure tried, and there was a cadre of us who tried very hard to survive the company, and I feel partly responsible for that. I never felt that we had a chance to convince Delta, and we certainly had no chance to convince the bankruptcy court of our ability to survive. But the people that worked around the table on the survival plan, I feel so sorry for them as well. They put heart and soul 24/7 into the plan, and never to get the opportunity to present it. I don't say it's sinful, but it surely sticks in my craw.
Since you left Pan Am, did you have any further contact with Thomas Plaskett or Ed Acker?
I did. Let's see. I'm trying to remember that. I saw, not with Tom. I reached out to Tom at one point about just before he died to tell him how much I appreciated his friendship, because we were really good friends. He was at American Airlines when I was with Eastern, and he's such a good person. And I think I reached out to him by telephone a couple of times. In fact, Tom came by the office in the Pan Am building, and he and his wife and I visited for a while. But I still to this day don't know why he decided to leave or he left. In terms of Ed Acker, you asked about Ed Acker?
Yes, Ed Acker.
I don't recall that I did hook up with him afterwards. I knew him, but I wouldn't say we were close.
Looking back at Pan Am history, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, there were some events that were beyond anyone's control in the airline, such as Lockerbie and deregulation and the government playing favorites with route systems over the years. As an aviation professional and as the last CEO of Pan American World Airways, I'm sure you've thought about what different choices could have been made that may have had different outcomes. Would you like to share any of those?
Tom, I got to tell you, I'm really happy that you asked that question, because I've opined over the years to various people that my thinking of why Pan Am failed. Clearly, Lockerbie hurt deeply in terms of the airline, the company. But I think there are two essential reasons why Pan Am, in the end, failed to survive. The first was back in you'll have to help me on that, but back in the 60s, if not 50s, Pan Am went to the then CAB to ask for domestic routes in order to feed its international routes. And that was essential, because up till then, Pan Am had to rely on other carriers to feed its airports in San Francisco, Miami, LA, New York, and so forth, and because that was, in effect, their hub, but without domestic feed. And I think when TWA was given some international routes and Pan Am was denied domestic routes to feed its hubs, if you will, international hubs, that was a early thorn or a nail in the body of Pan Am, because that set Pan Am back. They had to rely on other airlines to feed its gateways. And the other one was, and when deregulation occurred, which in itself hurt Pan Am dearly because it didn't have that domestic feed, Pan Am reached out to try to connect with another domestic airline in terms of a merger, which it did with National Airlines in Miami. And I argue to this day that was not a good merger. National had routes that didn't clearly feed into Pan Am's gateways, and as a result, National, it was a merger, but it was not a merger of positive consequence. And I think that, combined with the early rulings on domestic route authority, I think that hurt Pan Am greatly. So I think it was a cloud. You could argue. I've heard people argue that Mr. Tripp bought too many airplanes too early. That he did. He made a habit, God bless him, out of being the first to fly the 747, the first to fly the 706, that kind of thing. And that probably he probably didn't have the payloads to justify some of those acquisitions. But having said that, I don't think that was the contributing cause. I think it was the other two factors: lack of domestic routes for decades to feed its hubs, and the situation that occurred with the merger of National. Lockerbie is always mentioned, and boy, that hurt everybody.
We have a lot of young people that listen to this program. Do you have any messages to them on why Pan Am history is important as the last CEO?
Well, I think Pan Am represents much of the glamour of aviation. I mean, it epitomized the glamour of aviation as it was growing. I think in terms of career planning, I always recommend get in the airlines. It's a fun business. It's a different business today. It's a commercial business. The CEOs today are different than the CEOs of my era. My era, they basically were driven by marketing and public relations, and in today's era, they're essentially finance officers and who are CEOs. But my message is that Pan Am is to be glorified because of its glory. It represents an era of history that I think won't be duplicated in the foreseeable future, unless there's a new supersonic transport that comes along and recaptures glamour. But I don't see that happening. I just think my advice to people who are listening, and thank you for doing so, think of Pan Am as a epitome of the inventive and glory days of aviation.
Anything else you'd like to add?
I think of I don't know how many people who were employed by Pan Am are still around. I hope many of them are, and I know a lot of them ended up at Delta. But gosh, I don't have anything else I can possibly add to that. I just hope that people remember the good days.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for your time, sir. It's an honor to have you on this program. In those 100 days, I think everybody can agree that you tried to put forth a valiant effort. Unfortunately, in the end, it did not work, but it certainly was not your fault or a lack of trying.
Tom, I appreciate those words because there are those who did fault me for failing, and I take it personally. I don't use the we failed. I failed, and it's very nice of you to say that. But I bet part of my farm on survival. But having said that, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you, Tom.
All right, thank you, sir. Take care.
Bye.
We're going to take a quick break with what is presumed to be the very last TV commercial of Pan American World Airways, aired in early 1991.
There's one airline that flies to more cities in Europe than all other U.S. airlines combined. And right now, that airline is offering more low Eurosaver fares to more of Europe than all of the U.S. airlines combined. Plus, discounts on hotels and rental cars. And that's why people who fly that airline will enjoy themselves more than people who fly other airlines. The airline, Pan Am, the #1 airline to Europe.
Welcome back. Mark Pyle joined the U.S. Navy in 1969, serving in Vietnam. He left the Navy in 1973 and joined National Airlines. Captain Pyle flew with National until officially joining Pan Am in 1981 with the merger. He continued flying with Pan Am until the end in December 1991, when he became the last Clipper, flying the final revenue flight of Pan American World Airways from Barbados to Miami. He then flew for United Airlines from 1992 to 2005. After hanging up his wings, Captain Pyle fulfilled a boyhood dream and became a police officer in 2007 and retired in 2012. Welcome to the Pan Am podcast, Captain Pyle.
Well, thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. It's nice to be here.
It's nice to have you. It's quite an honor to have the last Clipper on the program. Let's talk a little bit about your career before we start talking about December 4th, 1991. What got you interested in aviation?
Well, my dad was a TWA captain, and I grew up in a TWA household around airplanes. Started flying when I was pretty young, probably before 14, and I always had a desire to follow in my dad's footsteps.
And what aircraft did your dad fly for TWA?
He started on the DC-3, the Martin 404. I think he flew every model of Constellation that was available. The Boeing 707, the 720B, the Convair 880, the L-1011, and he ended up his career on the 747.
So let's talk about what happened after you were 14. So you started flying when you were 14, and then you went through high school, and then you graduated high school, and then what happened?
Well, I got my license about a little after I got my driver's license. I got my my private pilot's license at a little operation in Kansas City on old Casey downtown. Called Baker Aviation, and then I went to college, and although I couldn't fly obviously commercially yet, I flew somewhat for the college in that I volunteered my time and picked up celebrities from Wichita and flew them down to Southwestern and Winfield, Kansas, and on a couple of occasions, and dropped things like ping pong balls and newspapers and things like that when I was in college. And then after I graduated, I went into the Navy.
And how long were you in the Navy?
Supposed to have been 5 years. I was a little bit short of that. The war was winding down. I did my year in Vietnam. And when I came back, I went from the Vietnam conflict to Oceana and Virginia Beach, and flew the F-4 there. But I did not go into the fleet on the F-4. I got out early in hopes of getting an airline career started, but that didn't happen. There weren't any jobs at that time, so I floundered around for a while as a security guard and some other low-paying opportunities, and then eventually got a job with National in the fall of 1973.
And what was your first aircraft that you flew for National?
I flew first officer on the 727. They had professional flight engineers at National, so you got to start right in the right seat of a 727, which was, I think, probably the only airline that did that in those days. There may have been another one, but I'm not aware of it. And so that was a great opportunity.
And this was in the mid-1970s?
1973, October of 73 is when I started with National Airlines.
And your father was flying for TWA at the time?
He was. Actually, met him a couple of times on various airports around the country where he happened to be on the ground at the same time I was.
Did you ever get a chance to fly your father on one of your flights? I
had the opportunity to fly him. I was in the training department for a good many years, and I had the opportunity to take him out into the Everglades at 0 dark 30 on an Airbus A300 with some student pilots, trainees, I should say. They weren't students; they were fully capable airline pilots, but to get their training on the Airbus A300, and I had an opportunity to take my dad, and it was a great fun, and I still cherish that memory.
Was that with Pan Am at the time?
That was Pan Am. That's correct. We were the launch customer on that airplane. I think it would have been 1985 or thereabouts that I had that opportunity.
So how was it working for National Airlines in the mid to late 1970s?
Well, I have great memories of National Airlines. I had wonderful captains that I flew with as a young co-pilot. They were, for the most part, there's always one or two, but they were excellent pilots. We flew a lot of short segment legs, which provided a great deal of opportunity to learn the airplane up and down and up and down. You could actually fly, I believe it was 9 legs in the state of Florida before you got outside. You would start in, just for instance, you would start in Miami. You go to Fort Lauderdale, and then West Palm Beach, and then I think Daytona Beach, Orlando, Tallahassee, Panama City, Pensacola, and then finally get out of the state at Mobile. That would be one type of a segment that you would fly. So, it wasn't unusual for you as a young co-pilot to get 5 or 6 landings a day. So your skill levels increased fairly dramatically from the first time you got in the airplane. It was great fun, absolutely wonderful fun with great guys.
And you were flying the 727. What other aircraft were you flying at the time?
I started just on the 727, and then eventually, as the merger took place, Pan Am acquired us in 1981. I was a dual qualified pilot on both the 727 and the DC-10 at that time.
And when were you promoted to captain?
Let's see. It took a long time because you didn't accelerate. The captaincies weren't exactly accelerated in those days. Let's see. I captained 1988 was my first captain assignment, and that was in New York.
And what did your dad think when you called him up and you told him that you made Pan Am captain?
Well, he was excited for me. At that time, he retired in '84, so he'd been retired about 3 or 4 years before I made captain. But obviously, still, he was still happy for me and excited for the impending career at Pan Am, and I was too. There was really no reason to believe in 1985 that we wouldn't have a viable operation, so I was quite excited as well.
Tell us a little bit about your Pan Am career. Did you have any favorite aircraft that you flew?
Well, my favorite airplane has always been and probably always will be the 727 because it's just such a wonderful airplane for a pilot to fly. It's you caress that airplane. You don't jump on the autopilot like you do on certain airplanes where you gear up and autopilot on. It was just a nice airplane. You flew it to altitude, trimmed it up, put it on autopilot, took it off autopilot, descended the airplane, and frequently landed the airplane without the autopilot. Thinking back to National again, just very quickly, we were the only airline, I believe, at that time that was Cat 2 certified to hand fly the airplane to approach altitude. So it was a great airplane. Obviously, it got to be too expensive with 3 engines and 3 cockpit crew, but that'll always be my favorite. My second most would probably be the 777, just because of the magic. But that was later on in a career with another airline.
Let's talk about December 4th, 1991. You are in Barbados the morning of that day, getting ready to take off and come to Miami. And then what happened?
Well, we actually started the trip in New York, in JFK. And at that time, the news was fairly obvious that things weren't going to go well. So that's be an understatement, I suppose. So the mood in the briefing area and the pilot operations area was somber with everybody. And then departing the field was a beautiful day and a beautiful airplane, a 727, one of the newer 727s. And so we found out I think it was somewhere over Bermuda, the engineer received a word from the company that the airline had shut down. So it was not exactly news to us when we landed in Barbados that we'd ceased operations. And the station manager in Barbados brought us out a piece of paper with the cessation of operations on it. And obviously the mood was very low at that point, very dark. And flight attendants were all crying, and a lot of the station personnel were crying. And the station manager asked if we would mind taking the airplane on to Miami with some of the station personnel who needed to get home, and they had gone back into the city wherever their apartments or rental places to pick up their gear and return to the field. So we said we would do that, and took the airplane to Miami later that afternoon, which ended up, as you know, being the last revenue flight airborne for Pan Am on December 4th, 91.
Some of our listeners, believe it or not, are younger people, and they were born after the airline shut down, but we have listeners from all over the world, and some of them a great deal of them are younger people that are fascinated by Pan Am history. Walk us through the flight back to Miami from Barbados.
Well, it was difficult. Number one, that was supposed to be my co-pilot's leg, and I told him that since this is the last leg, I'm taking it. So his name was Bob Knox, and I took his leg. He was very gracious about it, but I'm sure he would like to have flown it. So anyway, we left Barbados. I believe the station manager, actually, whose name I do not remember, it's too long ago, bought fuel on his own credit card to operate the airplane to Miami. And I'm sure that wasn't inexpensive, and I don't know to this day whether he was ever reimbursed or not, but he was gracious enough to do it. Some personnel from the town came out with flowers, and I think there was a news crew or two there interviewing the various crew members and station personnel. So we departed, and there was a lack of sophistication certainly in the avionics in those days compared to what people operate now, but I believe we got a clearance something like direct to Miami on our navigation system, which I don't even remember truthfully at this time what it was, but plugged in Miami and went pretty much straight to Miami. And when we got there, when the engineer calls in range, he said, "Mark, we're the last airplane airborne." And I said, "What do you mean we're the last airplane airborne?" He said, "Well, we're the last flight anywhere in the world, revenue flight anywhere in the world, being operated by Pan Am. We're the last one." And I said, "Well, wow, that's crazy." So we started our descent, and as we approached the field, the tower asked us if we would do a flyby, and I hadn't done one of those since I was in the Navy. And with a full airplane on board, you have to be somewhat careful about how you operate the airplane. So I think I put flaps to, a very small flap setting, and so that I wouldn't bust any FARs over the field, and came in fairly low over the field and down the runway, and then turned downwind and then base for the runway. And so we had a tiny bit of an air show for the guys in the tower. And the amazing thing was that you kind of got the feeling looking at the field, all the American airplanes were lined up there, and the Delta airplanes and everything. And it was a somber feeling when you realized that, in my opinion anyway, the greatest airline in the history of airlines, Pan Am, the initial airline to explore the world and set up navigation and do all the things that Pan Am had done for all that period of time, was about to set down for the last time, and these airlines were taking our routes. So it was you had a multifaceted feeling going on. There was no euphoria about being the last flight, I can guarantee you that. So then we landed and taxied in, and the water cannons were fired over the airplane, and a bunch of personnel, probably even other than Pan Am, but a lot of guys lined up in semi-military formation, saluting us as the water cannons passed over the airplane. And I kind of, at that time, I began to have a tear or two, I don't mind telling you. And it was a little difficult to, had to keep wiping my eyes to get into the parking system to get to the gate. So it was a difficult day, Tom, a difficult day.
Looking back 31 years, I mean, you made history yourself. You were the bookend of Pan Am history. For 64 years, Pan Am went around the world, first to conquer the Pacific, the Atlantic, flew celebrities from all over the world, dignitaries, was part of history, flying presidents, and you, Mark Pyle, is the last Clipper captain. Looking back 31 years, how does that make you feel?
Well, I think you can't really feel elated about an experience that was the death blow to as you've already referred to, the greatest airline probably in the history of airlines anywhere. I think all of us were struck at the fact that we were the last, and I think everybody in that cockpit was struck that we were the last. But that takes nothing away from everybody who operated an airplane that day, or for that matter, any other day for Pan Am. You know, it was just the culmination of history. We just happened to not fortuitously, by any stretch of the imagination, to be the last crew. I have no idea why it was me, or Bob or Chuck, the other two flight deck crew members that day, why we were the last. Fate, I guess. But it was by no means a happy occasion, and I am struck less by, my operation of the last airplane than I am by the fact that the airline is gone even to this day. I mean, it's just a sad thing. I have memorabilia around my office here of National and Pan Am and United, where I ended up my less than stellar career, and various models, but I have none more special to me than the Clipper Goodwill on my desk that one of my sons had made for me. It'll always be my treasure, and it makes me still sad to this day that the airline's gone, and that all the people who contributed to it over the course of time lost that piece of history right along with the crew on my flight deck that day.
How do you talk to your children about your experiences with Pan Am and Pan Am in general?
Well, truthfully, they probably don't have the interest in it that maybe some of the younger people that you alluded to earlier do listening to this program. My son did not follow in my footsteps. He was a chef, and he's in the food industry.
Well, that has advantages too.
Yeah, I suppose it does. I suppose so. But so I don't really think that that's something that they dwell on. I mean, they have a casual interest in it. Like, for instance, last year when I went out to San Fran, they wished me good luck in the speech I gave out there with Al Gilbert and to that group. But it's not something that they dwell on every day because it's not their field of interest.
What are some of the most favorite places you visited over the years?
Well, had the opportunity, having been in the training department, to have my family with me in Toulouse when Pan American was the launch customer for the Airbus A300. And we spent a year through 84 and 85, some part of 12 months in there, in Toulouse, working with trainees and doing the training on the initial startup of that airplane. So that would be certainly our first and probably happiest time with the airline. It was wonderful. So Toulouse was our most favorite thing as a family, and we enjoyed that immensely, having the opportunity to start up an airplane like that for the first time, to be the launch customer on that airplane and one of the first instructors on the airplane, and one of the first FAA designees on the airplane. Actually, it even goes farther than that. I had an opportunity, since we did not have the simulator yet, to write a manual system for airplane training on the Airbus A300. And what is it, Part 95 or something like that? I can't remember now. It's been too many years ago since I did this. But anyway, the airplane training manual on that airplane, and take crews out into the Everglades at night, or go to wherever the airplane happened to stop that day, like Dallas or New York. We'd use Newburgh, for instance, in the New York area, Old Stewart Air Force Base, or Longview, Texas. I think that's also an old either Navy training or Air Force Base, and then go back to Toulouse and work with another crew. So that was fantastic. And then in between all these opportunities, we got a chance to learn how to ski, and took the kids skiing in the Alps and down into the Pyrenees and things like that. So Toulouse was fantastic. Other than Toulouse, as far as layovers and things like that goes, San Francisco, back in the nice times in San Francisco, was a wonderful layover, believe it or not. Pensacola, Savannah, London, of course, was nice. I spent a lot of time in Oslo, Norway, training on the 737 when Pan American transitioned away from the 727 to the 737 for the IGS Berlin operation, and had an opportunity to fly that airplane for, I think, 3 years, and teach on that airplane for 3 years, and also work as an FAA designee on that airplane. So I had a lot of fun in the training department with Pan Am, and they treated us very, very well, and I'm very appreciative, and I'll always have a very special place in my heart for Pan Am.
Did you ever have any close calls in your aviation career? Emergencies, in-flight emergencies?
You know, I've been very, very, very fortunate in that regard. I lost one engine climbing out of Miami on the way to New York on a 727, and simply turned around and dumped fuel and came back and landed. I had a brake fire also in Miami with a student captain. I shouldn't say student captain, but a new captain that I was doing his initial line operation evaluation on. And so that's about it. No, I can't say that I ever had any really close calls. Of course, weather was different. You know, we operated differently in weather. Today they drive thousands of miles to avoid weather, and we would just generally kind of sort of pick and choose our way through it in my time. But not very many close calls that I can think of. So I was very fortunate in that regard, Tom.
So I have a burning question. Did the gentleman pass that you were evaluating with the brake fire?
Yeah, I mean, it was not his fault. The brakes locked up, and he had nothing really to do with that. It was simply an airplane malfunction. So,
but talk about an initiation test. My word.
Yeah, that's true. But I think that's the only time I ever had any kind of a fire on an airplane that I can recall. So that's good.
So what happened after Pan Am?
Well, on the way back from Miami, I had to go back to New York and pick up all my clothes and close down the apartment that several of us maintained together in Queens. And upon landing in Kansas, U.S. Airways was nice enough to take me home. Didn't have to, but they gave me a seat anyway because the airline was gone, right? But they still, I imagine they provided many Pan Am pilots their last way home. And upon arrival, I came into the house and set my bag down and looked at my wife and started bawling like a little baby. It was a tough time, trying to figure out how you're going to feed your family and make the house payment and all the things that were going to come down the pike with no job. So it was a very tough night coming home like that. So anyway, then once that happened, a couple of nights later, I can't remember exactly how many, but it wasn't too long thereafter, after feeling sorry for myself a sufficient amount of time, the phone rang, and there was a gentleman on the other end of the phone whose name he portrayed to be Jacques Legrand, Jack the Great, right? So I thought to myself, that can't be anybody's name. That can't be possible. So I'm thinking this has got to be one of my friends having their way with me in some kind of a joke. And so he said, no, monsieur, I am Jacques Legrand, and I guess I should back this up one tiny little bit. I ended up writing an article for the Miami Herald called Pan Am, the Last Clipper, from whence, my little moniker has been engendered over the course of time, I guess, the Last Clipper. But And this article ended up getting somewhat syndicated and went at least to Europe. I'm not sure what other countries it went to, but so this gentleman had read the article, and he was a Belgian slant French entrepreneur who was in the publishing business, and said that he had seen my article and that he would like to do an interview. Would we mind flying over to Paris to do this interview? And so my initial reaction is, of course, this is nuts. This is not a real person. So I said, look, let me check into this and call me in a couple of days and I'll think about this. And so in the meantime, my wife and I went to a bookstore, and lo and behold, his books were in this bookstore. So as incredible as that seems, he was on the up and up. So he did call back in a couple of days. He flew us over first class on an airline that time called Sabina, which is I think they're out of business now, to a Belgian airline. And then he picked us up from Brussels in his Citation and flew us into Paris Orly, where we were met with a champagne and caviar reception at the airport and interviewed. Yeah, crazy. And interviewed by some local news people and stuff like that. To make a long story short, over the next couple of days in several interviews with Mr. Legrand, he offered us a job, myself to write for him in a new book called The Chronicle of Aviation, and my wife to do some of the merchandising for the book, because that was kind of what she was involved in at the time also. And so that gave us a job for a year, and it was a godsend because he asked us what we wanted, and I said, well, if you can afford it, the same thing we made at our last year in Pan Am. So we went from being paupers and thinking we were going to be in the street to having a lifeline thrown at the very last minute that was, at the very least, our salvation at that time. Only God works in ways like that. It has to be God. It couldn't be anything else. So it was amazing.
And then you went flying again.
Yes. After having gone to sell the book in Oshkosh in the summer, I guess, what is that, August, I guess, of 92, I thought, some of my friends have been calling me and said, are you going to go up and interview at United? And I didn't think about it before that time with too much enthusiasm, but as more and more of my friends called me and encouraged me and told me they were going to do it, I did too. And so I ended up starting all over on the bottom as a flight engineer on the 727, from whence I had been flying captain only a short time before, and from the left seat to the back seat, removing food trays and taking them back to the galley. So, yeah, it was.
How was that? How was that transition for you?
Well, I was thankful to have a job, but on the other hand, I was a pretty decent 727 pilot, and to watch some people ham-fist the 727 around like they did when the guys at National and Pan Am had caressed that airplane so beautifully and knew its nuances and how to make it purr rather than roar. It was kind of interesting to not be anywhere around the controls.
How did the United crew view you as a veteran Pan Am national pilot?
Well, for the most part, I think all of us newbies at United were treated remarkably well, considering we were all starting over, and many of us from senior positions at Pan Am to very lowly junior positions at United. There was no attempt to obviously integrate seniority lists or anything like that, although that had been done previously when routes were sold from Pan Am, sold some Atlantic routes and I think eventually some Pacific routes back in around 85 or 86, and all those people had been integrated, but there was no such integration attempted, so we were all on the bottom. At that case, I think I had, I was 44, so I had 15, 16 years left to look ahead as to try to put some type of a career together after having lost essentially our pensions and everything else at Pan Am. So,
and that's what's amazing to me when I talk to pilots and flight attendants and maintenance crews that lost everything when Pan Am ceased operations. They still have such loyalty and fondness for the airline.
Oh yeah, well, you know, I mean, it wasn't in the broadest sense, it wasn't the airline that crushed Pan Am. In many ways, it wasn't even the management, although I guess I would tend to attribute some of the demise to management. Much of it, and perhaps the larger amount of it, was due to the government bureaucracy having isolated Pan American from domestic routes for so many years, and at the same time having delved out the routes that Pan Am sought to airlines like TWA and American and others that were upcoming at that time, and Pan Am was restricted to the international route system. So a lot of it, you can't even say that it was in any sense Pan Am. Like I said, tiny bit management, but more the way the government treated Pan American, and evidently due to the fact that maybe one trip had crossed a few paths with some bureaucrats, governmental bureaucrats along the way. But yeah, no, I have no animosity towards anything Pan Am. I just have a wonderful, and just having the opportunity now to talk about Pan Am is an elating feeling for me.
So tell us a little bit more about your United career.
Well, I started as a flight engineer, as I already had mentioned, and then it wasn't too long thereafter that I got a bid in Los Angeles on the Guppy, the 737, so I went out there to fly on the 737. And then I had an opportunity to fly on the 777, a little bit down the road from that. I can't remember exactly what year it was that these things occurred now. It's just not that important to me, frankly. But when I was on the 777, I guess I did a good enough job in my training on that airplane to be asked to be an instructor on that airplane. And so I instructed on the 777 for 2 or 3 years until I made captain, which, the original captain job earlier with National Pan Am took me like 16 years, and it took only 6 at United, or 7, something like that. So I was flying captain on the 737 out of San Francisco and commuting out there from Kansas City, and eventually was asked to come into the flight department at the flight office in San Fran, and I became a flight manager on the 737 when they were operating the shuttle out there. I was kind of the shuttle flight manager, and that was great fun. I enjoyed flying that shuttle greatly. It was kind of like, and as you might already guess, it was very similar to the start I had at National. A lot of up and downs every day, short leg up and downs, and I had a great time doing that. And then I ended up being taken in as a chief pilot on the 737 in the training department at Denver for a few months, only because the big boss out there didn't really like me very much, and I got axed about 6 months into my chief pilot agency, whatever it would be called. So, you can't win them all. You can't win them all.
Mm-hmm. Very true. And then did you leave United at that point?
I flew the line for a couple more years, and then when I was 59, I developed a couple of issues with some neuropathy type things, which I am told has to do with my Agent Orange ingestion in my Vietnam experience. So I got myself in the best shape of my life at that point and went to the police academy.
Oh, tell us about that.
Actually, my son at that time had been working for a contractor in Afghanistan. And he encouraged me to get my butt up off the sofa and get myself in some decent shape and try to do something that I had wanted to do when I was a kid. You know, when you're a kid, you either want to be a cop or a cowboy. At least when I was growing up, that's what you wanted to do, or a baseball player, I guess. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do it. And I worked very hard to get myself into pretty good shape, and went to the police academy, graduated somewhat incredulously first in my class with a bunch of young guys, really.
And you're 59, 60 years old at this time?
Yeah, I was 59 at that time, and was the best shooter in the class, believe it or not. I think because my son had trained me. You know, he was a really good shot over there in the things that he did. So I did that and got out from the police academy. I had 5 offers for a job and ended up working with an interior city in Kansas City, a place called Grandview, Missouri, which is essentially an industrial part of Kansas City. And had a great time there for 5 years. I actually made the SWAT team when I was 61. So,
that's awesome. That's a great story.
It was great fun. Yeah, it was great fun, and something I'll always cherish. Kind of like the last Clipper.
So, Navy pilot, commercial airline pilot for National, Pan Am, and then United, and then you worked on this book in between United and Pan Am, and then you became a police officer.
I did.
That's a great story.
Well,
that's a great story.
Thank you kindly.
So, looking back at your career, what message do you have for young people that might be listening? Career advice, people that, you know, want to become a police officer or want to become an aviation professional or anything for that matter.
Yes. Well, you know, it's a very difficult time to be a cop. There's no doubt that right now is a tough time. Those guys, I have the utmost respect for anyone who lays their life on the line every day, straps the badge and the gun on, and goes to work. So anyone that would choose to do that, you are, in my opinion, you are a knight in shining armor in a savage land. That harkens back to a TV show a long time ago, I think, called Have Gun Will Travel, but that's the way I feel about it. You're immeasurably high on my esteem list if you choose to do that in this day and age, and more power to you. As far as flying an airplane goes, it's going to be enormously expensive right now with fuel costs and things like that to go the civilian route, so I would encourage people who are interested in doing that to choose a military route. And then you may actually find that job is so challenging and interesting that you may not want to even think about an airline career. But should you do so, choose to do so, I think that's probably the method whereby you would be most able to achieve that goal. And then certainly the airline career is worthwhile. I think more so now than when I was doing it, because the industry seems to have stabilized a little bit anyway over what was going on during my what should have been the prime of my career. So those are the things I would choose. But as far as if you're a really young person out there listening to this, get all the math and science that you can, because should you find that either one of those jobs, airline or police, aren't what you want to do, then certainly the technical jobs, the technical fields are something that are challenging and in demand right now. So don't take basket weaving. Take something that you can put in your back pocket in your wallet eventually.
Good advice. So let's settle a score. We have one of our board members, Pamela. She was married to an Air Force general, and she, when she flies, she can tell the background of the pilot by how the plane lands. She claims that a smooth landing is an Air Force veteran and a hard landing is a Navy veteran. Do you have any comment?
Well, here's what I would tell. You said Pamela?
Pamela, yes.
That she would, had she been on one of my flights, she would have guessed me to be Air Force.
That's very diplomatic. Very good.
Okay.
Anything else you'd like to add? Would you like to tell us a little bit about how you look back at Pan Am in a historical way?
There's just absolutely no doubt in my mind that the most historical airline, the most contributing airline to every other airline, to aviation itself, the opening of routes, the early navigational systems that made international flying possible, the boats, the great flying boats that Pan Am operated around the world. All these things helped characterize the airline as what it was, a great, fantastic, historical airline, of which I am so proud to have been even a small part. And even though I came from a different airline, national, to start out with, as I mentioned last year at the Pan Am convention in San Francisco, if you cut me, I bleed blue. So it's a wonderful time, a wonderful opportunity to have flown for the world's premier airline. Look what they did in World War II, for instance. I mean, essentially they were an extending arm of the United States government. It just did so much. It opened so much. It created so much. It led the way. It blazed the trail for everyone else. There's no doubt about it. And it's just so sad that it was a victim of its own success in some ways, because I think so many people in high places were jealous of Trip, you know.
You know, you're right in the sense that for many years, Pan Am had such a stellar reputation that people thought it was too big to fail. And if the government would allow them to have domestic routes, then it would almost be like a monopoly. And it was almost, like you said, it's the company's success was almost its downfall.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Anything else you'd like to add to our interview?
Oh, I can't think of anything. I'm very thankful that to have the opportunity. I consider it an honor to speak with you and to have an opportunity to address the audience that you have out there. So I'm just thankful to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and I wish you every success with your Pan Am Museum and this podcast.
Well, thank you, sir. Pan Am was a pioneer in air travel and still stands as one of the most iconic and innovative airlines in aviation history. That legacy lives on at the Pan Am Museum in Garden City, New York, where you can explore the rich history of the aircrafts and individuals at the heart of the company known as the world's most experienced airline. For more information about the Pan Am Museum, check out our website at www.thepanammuseum.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. As was once a tagline in one of our commercials, we would greatly appreciate your support to help the Pan Am Museum continue making the going great. You can also support the museum by shopping on our online store for all things Pan Am, accessories, apparel, jewelry, books, models, and posters. We want to hear from you. If you have a question for us or want to share your story, our email address is podcast@thepanammuseum.org. As flight crews once said to passengers departing for their destinations around the world, thank you for flying, Pan Am.